was speaking where the leprous lesion heals, and the Kohen comes, examines it, the location where initially there was this leprous lesion, and it seems to be it's gone. Now we have to begin this reinstatement process. Torah tells us he takes two birds, which are kosher species, which have no defects, what we call treifa, no internal defects, veitz erez, a piece of cedar wood or acacia wood, a piece of cloth dyed crimson, azov, and an azov, a live growing grass, which is a hyssop grass. And Rashi says, why do you take birds? Toros, prat lov tome. Toros means it has a kosher species to exclude a non-kosher species. Fishan the goyim born of loshen hara. Because why initially did he become a leper? Because he had spoken loshen hara, spoken negatively about other people, which have no constructive value. Shumase pitpute dvorim. It's just pitpute. It's like whittling your words that have no value. I'll give you an example, because this is the point I can bring out. The Medrash, in the introduction to Medrash Eicho, which Eicho is the elegy which Yirmiyah Novi had written when he had witnessed the destruction of the first Beis Hamikdash. So the Medrash tells us that the leaders of the non-Jewish nations came before two great non-Jewish philosophers. Mentions their names there. It's not really relevant. It seems to be Greek names. And they posed the question to them, is it possible to destroy the Jews? So they had said to them, go visit the shuls. In the olden days, the Gemara tells us, the elementary schools, what we call the Malamed, the one who taught children, he conducted his classes in the shul, in the synagogue. So he says, go to the Batei Knesios, to the shuls, and see if you hear the chirping of children, meaning children being taught Torah. Over there, it doesn't use the word pitpute dvarim. Here it says pitpute dvarim also means like the chirping, but it's not chirping. Over there, use the word tziftzuf, tziftzufe yolodim. Tziftzuf is like the whistling. The tzavtzef is like the whistling of children. And the voice in the Botei Medrashos, in the study halls of adults studying Torah, if you hear that, the children you heard their chirping or their whistling, and the voice of the adults studying Torah, they're invincible. You cannot destroy them. Why? Because Yaakov received the bracha from his father, Akol Kol Yaakov, by Yadayim de Yosef. As long as the kol is Kol Yaakov, the voice is the voice of Jacob, which is, the voice is used for Torah. The children are studying Torah, and the adults are studying Torah. The Yadayim enemy de Yosef, the hands cannot be. Esav is not empowered. However, if it's silent, you don't hear the chirpings of the children in the shuls. And the Batei Medrashos and the study halls are silent, then the Jews are vulnerable, then it's Yadayim de Esav. That's what they advised them. But over there, the word used for the chirping of children is not pitpute dvarim. Pitput. It's tziftzufe. Tzavtzef means to whistle. The whistling of children. Here it's pitpute dvarim. The Gemara tells us that there was a person, his name was Putiel. Putiel. Why was he called Putiel? He like played around with Yitzhara. he was able to play with Yitzhara, meaning it did not take control of his life. So Pitrutvi Dvar means you take your words and you whittle it away. It's like a waste of words. The bird, when it chirps, what's its value? It's chirping, has no value. So because leficha hushku letaros et simushim fatfitin tome betziftzuf kol. See, now he says, you are pitpute dvarim. Why do you bring birds? To bring about the reinstatement, which is the purification. Shemefatfin tomid betziftzuf kol. They're always so-called like chattering with siftzuf. Now the term is betziftzuf kol, with like a whistling of kol, of their voices. Pitput means just like chattering. You chattered. You used the power of speech. You abused it. You wasted it. Therefore, you bring the bird. The bird represents that. They're always chattering with sips of kol, with sips. Gemara tells us that Rabbi Yonas ben Uziel was of the greatest students of Hillel HaZoken. And Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai, who became the Nasi, was the prince of the Jewish people. He was from the smallest students of Hillel HaZoken. Gemara are two locations, in Sukkah and Gemara Basra. So the Gemara asks, why was Rabbi Yonas ben Uziel the greatest, and Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai was from the lesser students? Is it because Rabbi Yonas ben Uziel knew more Torah, or had a greater understanding of Torah than Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai? The Gemara says no. That whatever Rabbi Yonas ben Uziel knew, Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai knew. What did he know? So the Gemara goes over there and delineates all what the different things they knew. What did they know? They knew sichas dekolim, the language of the trees. Sicha means the communication of trees. Sichas ophos, the language, the sicha of birds. They understand bird language. What do you mean they understand bird language? Meaning, when the trees, there are all kinds of energies in the world. And when the trees rustle, and you're able to discern the various levels of rustling, there's something being communicated through those rustling of those trees. Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai and Rabbi Yonas ben Uziel, they understood what those rustlings, what they represented, what those sounds meant. And when the birds chirped, different birds chirp differently. They have different sounds and different orders of chirping. They understood what that was. But it speaks about sichas dekolim and sichas ophos. The sicha. Sicha means the talk of the trees and the talk of the birds. So they each knew exactly what the other one knew. No one knew more than the other. So why was Rabbi Yonas ben Uziel greater than Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai? So our answer is because when Rabbi Yonas ben Uziel would study Torah, the birds that flew over his head, it generated such kedusha, such holiness, that the birds were burnt as they flew over his head. That was the intensity of the kedusha. However, Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai would study Torah, although it was the same Torah, it did not generate that level of holiness. Therefore, the birds were not consumed by fire as they flew over his head. That's the difference. But I'm just bringing over there again, there's the language of the birds. The Fatrin Tomid, they're always chirping. But Siftsuf Kov, what are they chirping with? Siftsuf, with a certain whistling or a tune, which is the voice, that's Siftsuf. And that's the Loshen, that's the word used in the Medrash. If the children are mitzavtzufin, they're chirping, what's the chirping of those children? They're chirping in Torah. They're studying Torah, then that's Kol Yaakov. Our Shiva used to say would say, and it turned out, I once showed him at the Yerushalmi, asked the question, if Rabbi Yonasan ben Uziel and Rabbi Yochanan, they knew everything. The difference was that when Rabbi Yonasan ben Uziel would study Torah, the birds would burn over his head. So what about Hillel HaZoken, when Hillel would study Torah? If the birds would burn over his head, so what how did that indicate a greater level than his most advanced student, Rabbi Yonasan ben Uziel, and Hillel was greater? So Rosh Hashiva used to say always, the Gemara tells us in Shabbos that Reb Shimon Yochai was in the Roman era time after they destroyed the Beis HaMikdash, and he was having a conversation with his colleagues, and he had spoken negatively about the Roman government. And word got back that he had said something, and he had to go into hiding. And he fled, and he went to the famous cave in Meron, where he's buried. And he went to a cave together with his son, Reb Lozer, and they studied Torah in the cave for 12 years. And they were hiding. They were hiding, and the Romans did not find him. And the Gemara tells us that they only had one suit of clothing. And if they would wear the clothing as they studied, ultimately the clothing would wear out. So what would they do? They would bury themselves in sand and cover their bodies and study Torah, and they would not wear their clothing. And when they would daven, they put the clothing on, but otherwise their bodies were covered with sand. When they would study Torah, they were covered. After 12 years, Reb Shimon Yochai hears a baskol that the Roman emperor died. It's a new mandate, and it's time to come out of the cave. Baskol says, now it's time to come out of the cave. So Reb Shimon Yochai and his son, they come out of the cave, and you know what it means? They were immersed in Torah, and a miracle happened while they were in a cave. Now, they need water, they need food. What happened? A wellspring presented itself, and that was the water that they had during all these years, which was right outside the cave, and a carob tree grew. Carob tree normally takes 70 years to grow. Miraculously, a carob tree grew. So the fruits, the carob, they lived on the carob. That was their sustenance, and the water. They come out of the cave. You understand? They was detached from this world, immersed in Torah at a very special level. And Rabbi Yonasan, Rabbi Shimon Yochai comes out and he sees people working the fields, and he couldn't tolerate it. I mean, how do you take your life and invest it in the material when time is so infinitely precious, where you could invest that time in studying Torah? So when he would look at whatever they did, what he gazed at just was burnt by fire, was consumed by fire. So the baskol comes out again. The heavenly voice says, Shimon, I didn't ask you to come out of the cave to destroy my world. Go back in the cave. So he and his son, they go back in the cave. After a year, after the 13th year, he comes out and he understands. He was able to somehow to balance the spiritual with the material, and he put it into context. And when he came out, he saw people plowing the fields, engaged in the material, in the mundane, and he gazed, it did not consume the fields. But his son, Eliezer, was not at that level. So whenever his son would look at something, and his son would actually cause it to be destroyed, Reb Shimon Yochai would look and protect it. It should not affect it. This was after the 13th year. So what happened? When he came out after 12 years, he was not at that level. He was able to somehow coalesce everything, put everything in perspective. Although he was very holy, he only burnt up everything because his intensity of holiness. When he came out after 30 years, he was no less holy, he was more holy. And yet, he was able to reconcile the world with who he was. So what do we see? That if you're at that special level, you could generate Kedusha, but the Kedusha doesn't destroy everything. He would say that Hillel, when the birds would fly over his head, they would what? It would be due to the greatness of Hillel that he was able somehow to control it, that it wasn't in contradiction to the world. So the birds were not destroyed. That's what he would say. Okay? I don't think he said it from himself. He said that's what they said when he studied in Europe. That's the way they reconciled this issue. What's the difference between Hillel and Rebbe Uziel? Because you could ask a question based on what he said. So how do you know Reb Yochanan ben Zakkai was the less of the students? Maybe the reason why they weren't consumed because he was greater, because he was able to control it. No different than his Rebbe. Okay, I never asked that question in Rosh Hashiva. But I was studying, when I studied Bava Basra, then I look into Miri. Miri's an earlier commentator on the Masechta, and he cites Yerushalmi, Jerusalem Talmud. And the Yerushalmi asked this question. If this was Rabbi Yodas ben Uziel, his greatness, so what was the Rebbe? Hillel. So the Yerushalmi answers, Hillel, when he would study Torah, it was Toch, Yodas ben Uziel was Toch Dalar Amos. The birds that were within his proximity, within 4 cubits, those are the birds that were burnt, were consumed by fire. Hillel was so great, even the birds that were outside of his 4 amos, outside of his proximity, they were also burned by fire. That was the degree of Kedusha of Hillel Zoki. Not like Moshe Shiva said, but that was the greatness. Pinchas ben Yoyer, the famous Pinchas ben Yoyer, where the Gemara says, if we classify the early generations as malochim, as angels, Gemara says, then we can be classified as human beings. And if we classify the early generations as bnei Adam, then our classification is chumrim, like donkeys. If they are Adam, we are donkeys. And even if we're donkeys, we're not even the level of Chamorish of Pinchas ben Yoyer. The donkey of Pinchas ben Yoyer. Who is the donkey of Pinchas ben Yoyer? Thieves stole the donkey of Pinchas ben Yoyer, and they wanted to feed the donkey untithed grain. The donkey wouldn't need to untie the grain. You understand? The donkey, being the asset of Pinchas ben Yoyer, was so holy, although it's an unintelligible creature. It has sensitivity. It would not eat of that grain because it was not tithed. The thief said, "This is a crazy donkey. They can't feed it. So what's the value of having the donkey?" He said, "Let it go." The donkey returned, went back to Pinchas ben Yoyer. Pinchas ben Yoyer was the father-in-law of Reb Shimon Yochai. That was his father-in-law. So you can understand what we're talking about here. The Silsa Sharim, Reb Yonason, the Ramchal, authored his work based on the Bryce of Pinchas ben Yoyer, which is stated in Avodah Zarah. Zerus, maybe there's Rizus. You need watchfulness, vigilance. That brings to alacrity, and alacrity brings to this. That's the Bryce of Pinchas ben Yoyer. So Mar tells the story in Shabbos. Pinchas ben Yoyer hadn't seen his son-in-law for 13 years because he was in hiding. And he notices his flesh. He has crevices in his flesh, like wounds. And he sees his son-in-law and he cries to see what he endured for all these years. That due to his body was covered in sand, it's like he had sores. And the tear, which has salt in it, his tear fell on the wound, on the crevice in the flesh of Shimichoi, and it caused him pain. And Pinchas ben Yoyer says to his son-in-law, "Woe to me that I see you in this state, that your body is all lacerated or cracked. You have these wounds from being immersed in sand, and you study Torah in such a state of deprivation that you have no clothing to wear. And therefore you come." So Reb Shimon Yochai says to his father, "Woe to me if you didn't see me this way. It's only because I sacrificed for the sake of Torah all those years. Therefore, I was able to achieve levels of understanding which I wouldn't have achieved otherwise." That was Reb Shimon Yochai's response to his father, Reb Pinchas ben Yoyer.
Rabbi?
The halacha is that if a person brings a chatos, a sin offering, which we studied, so the blood, the whole ritual is done in the outer courtyard, meaning it's not done in the covered sanctuary, which is called the hechel. It's the outer mizbeach is in this open area, and everything regarding that animal is done in the azora, in the sanctuary, which is outside. He receives the blood, and what does he do? He transports it to the mizbeach, sprinkles it. What happens if he takes that blood and brings it into the hechel? He brings it into the, not the ultimate inner sanctums, which is the Holy of Holies. He brings it into the hechel, the covered sanctuary. If you take the blood, take it outside of the azora, it becomes invalid. It's called yotze. It was taken out of its bounds. If you take the meat or the blood, it becomes posel. It was taken out of its bounds. So you'd say that's because he took it to a less holy location. What about if you take it into the hechel? The hechel is where the menorah was and where the shulchan was. You take it into the holier location. What happens to it? It's posel. Comes invalidated. What about if a king, which is called the nosi, when he would sin at a certain level, or it would be a parhelim dover, where the Sanhedrin ruled on behalf of Klal Yisrael, they had made a mistake, and the Jews did idolatry, they did other things, inadvertently, because the Sanhedrin ruled that it's not idolatry. There, the blood is taken into the inner sanctums, into the hechel. And it's not invalid. And then ultimately, you sprinkle it there, and then you pour the remainder on the base of the mizbeach outside. But why? So he explains it this way: the Orach HaKodesh, based on the Zohar. A person is a king of Klal Yisrael. Why does he merit to ascend to that level? The king is the highest office in the Jewish people, the Melech, and the laws were relating to the Melech. Som Tosim Aleichem Melech. And initially, Malchi Beis David, what were they? You from the Davidic line, they were anointed. No ordinary person is permitted to have the anointing oil put on his body. But if you're Malchi Beis David, if you're from the Davidic line, you're a king, you're anointed. Not only that, we speak about Hakel, that after 7 years, after the sabbatical year, the king would gather Klal Yisrael in the Temple Mount and in the Azora, in the sanctuary, and he would read Mishnah Torah. He would sit and read Mishnah Torah. But the question is, there's halacha Mishum Sinai, there's halacha, you're not permitted to sit in the sanctuary. You weren't permitted to sit. So how did the king sit when he read Sefer Dvarim? He read Sefer Dvarim from a Sefer Torah. So the Gemara answers, because the only people are permitted to sit in the sanctuary if you're from the Davidic line. If you're from Malchus Beis David and you're a king, that person is permitted to sit. He's the exception. The whole story, Reuven ben Nevat, when the kingdom of Israel was split, you had Malchus David and you had Malchi Yisrael. Reuven ben Nevat was from the Shevet Ephraim. He was the Melech Yisrael. Why did he bring idolatry to the Jewish people? He built his own temple, and that temple had golden calves, because he said, "What's going to be? It's going to come to Hakel." Although he was the most advanced sage among all the Jews, Reuven ben Nevat, he says, "What's going to be? The one from the Davidic line, he's going to sit in the sanctuary, and I'm going to have to stand. I'm not going to be permitted to sit." So they're going to see, all clouds are going to see the real king and the facade of king. I'll be disgraced. You know something? If that's the case, no more Hakel. Jews are not going to the Beis Hamikdash. There's not going to be the reading of Sefer Dvarim after the sabbatical year. I'll build my own temple, and they're going to worship golden calves. and he put sentries on the roads going to Yerushalayim. Any person went to Yerushalayim, he was killed. He wasn't permitted to ascend to the Temple Mount. Because only the king of Davidic line is permitted to sit in the Azara. So the most advanced Jew who has the greatest representation of spirituality is permitted to sit there. He's so-called God's representative. What does that mean? He has a different dimension of neshama. He has another level of soul. As a result of that, when he sins, being at that level, it's like he went and he breached the inner sanctums of God. Because his neshama is this advanced level, is closer. So when he sins, the ramification of that sin is much more serious than an ordinary Jew sinning. Because he has a much lesser level of neshama. Therefore, as a result of that, to reinstate himself, just as the sin went into the inner sanctums and tarnished or soiled that special neshama, you bring the blood into the inner sanctums, into the Azora, to reinstate it and to rehabilitate that. That's the Orach Chaim HaKodesh, name of the Zohar. But an ordinary Jew, that has no relevance to the inner sanctums to any degree. If you take that blood, because the whole reason is only to rehabilitate the neshama. It never went into the inner sanctums. Therefore, you leave it in the courtyard, and if the blood is brought into the Azara, the covered sanctuary, the blood is invalidated and the carbon is possible for that reason. So we speak about this Kano Adoros, the generations from Sinai. These people had different levels of neshamas. And because they had that other level of neshama, their capacity was a different capacity. They merited to be at Sinai, these neshamos. This was the 20% that left Egypt. This is the foundation of Klal Yisrael. These are what we call the root tribes. We had 12 tribes, whatever it was, they traveled in the desert, whatever, even though they sinned. And that's why when they sinned, the level of the consequence of that sin was much more serious. Because being so advanced, having that dimension, as a result of that, when you transgress at certain levels, the consequence is much more severe. And that's why Hashem reacted differently than he reacts to us for that reason, although there's a tochava. But only Hashem is able to make that evaluation. It's like the Rambam says in Hilchos Tshuva, he speaks about what's a tzaddik, rov zochios. If the majority of your accomplishments are positive, a merit, then you're a tzaddik. If the majority is negative, chov, person's classified as Rasha. And he says this evaluation, only the Kel Deos, God who knows everything, can make this evaluation. Why? It's not a quantitative evaluation, it's a qualitative evaluation. He says you find one sin in terms of its level of negative representation could be versus many, many mitzvahs. And one mitzvah could have such a great level of value, it has value versus many transgressions, many averos. So the only one who's able to make this evaluation for the balance, only the Kel Deos, because only he knows. But what goes into that evaluation? It's based on who you are, what your background is, what your shum is. All that is part of the equation. What is the degree and the seriousness and ramification of the sin or the value of the mitzvah? So the Ramchal writes, Rabbi Yonasan ben Uziel had a special neshama. And because he had that neshama, when he studied Torah, the energies which he generated activated many things in the spiritual worlds. He gives it to an example. If you have a watch, and you have movements in a watch, you have like wheels, and each wheel has notches on it, and each wheel notch is associated with another watch. So when one wheel turns, it causes another wheel to turn, another wheel to turn. And all these wheels are turning. And that's based on how they turn and with what intensity they turn. And that is determined by the intenseness of that energy of how many wheels it's able to turn. Rabbi Yonasan ben Uziel, in terms of the tzidkus, the same tzidkus. We're not saying he was a greater tzaddik than Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai. But in terms of he was endowed with a neshama, which had a greater dimension of neshama, therefore he was able to turn worlds that Rebbe Chaim Zanai couldn't turn those worlds. Didn't generate those levels of energies because his neshama was not at that level. In a little bit, why do you take a piece of acacia wood? Because the eres, the cedar tree, represents majesty. That's its eres. Because leprosy comes due to arrogance, haughtiness, self-centeredness. We find Rabbeinu Yonah in Shari Tshuva, which we learned, quotes a posuk, Tovas Hashem Kogov Alev, that it is an abomination of God, a person who has an inflated heart. Gov Alev is Tovas Hashem. He says something phenomenal. The Gemara, based on a posuk in Tehillim, says, if Hashem does not intervene, it's impossible to contend with the machinations of the Yetzer Hara. Gemara Sukkah, Gemara Basar. Unless Hashem intervenes, it's impossible to contend with the evil inclination. You need a special siyata d'shmaya. You need a divine intervention. So Rabbeinu Yonah writes, so if a person is not an abomination, Hashem will go to bat for that person. But if a person is Tovas Hashem Kogov Alev, but if you're an abomination of God, the one who has that Gov Alev, the exalted heart, that person doesn't merit that siyata d'shmaya. As a result of that, you're going to fall victim to the Yetzer Hara. That's Rabbeinu Yonah. So why does he speak Lashon Hara? He says, why does he bring the wood is acacia wood or the cedar wood? And so he brings this, which represents majesty, and therefore, as a result of that, this is part of the atonement. It's not who you think you are. You rethink it. You're not that. Come off your high horse. That's Eitz Eres. The Ramchal writes in the Derech Hashem, we speak about bringing about miracles through the conjugation of the letters of the Aleph base. This is the ultimate, certain level of Kabbalah. As it says that Betzalel, who oversaw the Mishkan, Yoda L'tzarf Osi Shniv Bo Shemayim V'Aretz. He knew how to conjugate the letters. That creation came about through the conjugation of those letters, which activated those energies. And he writes something very interesting. If a person knows how to conjugate letters, you're able to actually supersede the natural order. You can bring miracles. You can split the sea. You do not have to be a tzaddik. As long as you know the system, you're able to do it. But he says, if you do it, you have to realize you're being mishtabish b'sharvito b'shal melech. If you use the names of Hashem and you know how to conjugate them to change the laws of nature, you have to be at that level that you're doing it purely for the sake of Hashem. And if you think in a moment you're not there and you use them, you're using the scepter of the king. The scepter of the king can only be used for the king. If it's not for the king, you're using the scepter of the king. And if you use the scepter of the king, you're deserving to be put to death. Therefore, all we speak about Reb Chanina ben Dosa, these people were able to do miracles in the time of the Gemara. These people were world renowned, unquestioned who they were. As a result of that, they altered nature. Well, the Navi, you read the Rambam in Hilchos Sorata, what does it take to become a Navi? He has to perform a revealed miracle. He has to do a supernatural act and forecast the future. He's at that level. But that's to establish himself as a Navi Emes, as actually the one who God communicates to him. But otherwise, it's Mishtam Shabit Shal Melech. So the Ramban writes, a person who behaves with arrogance, we say in Tilim, we say in Psuki Dezim, Hashem Geus Lovish, Osis Hazor. It's a possible. We say in one of the days of the Yom, we say Shabbos, right? Mizvah Yom Shabbos, the paragraph afterwards. Hashem Moloch Geus Lovish. Hashem has reigned Geus Lovish. He's cloaked with Geus, with exaltedness. So what is exaltedness? Exaltedness is the scepter of God, of Hashem. So if you take that and behave in this exalted manner, and you don't represent him, that's mishtamish b'shavita shel melech, using the scepter of the king. What happens to use the scepter of the king? You become persona non grata. You put out of all the camps. When you speak Lashon Hara, that's a manifestation of that geus, of the what? Of Gova Lev. So now that you've done the tshuva, and the leprous lesion has healed, and you're being reinstated, what do? You take that piece of acacia wood, which represents majesty, which you use that majesty, we had no right to use it, because that's reserved exclusively for Hashem. Hashem Geus Lovesh. Ushni Tolos Ve'ezov. Ma takanoso. How do you correct that failing? The Yisrapi to be healed. Yashvil Atzmo B'Gaivoso. You lower yourself from that arrogant stance persona. Ketolas case like the worm and the hyssop grass, which is low-lying grass that grows on, that lies on the ground, grows on the ground level. That's the understanding.